All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about transport in plants. I kind of already wrote some stuff because with the first video kind of got messed up. So here's what's going to happen. Roots absorb water and minerals, okay? And so water and minerals are going to go in through the roots, okay? They're going to go here. It's mostly water at this point. The xylem is going to transport the water up to the leaves, and we'll talk about how that process works in just a second. And then the water is going to actually it's going to go out of the leaves. It's going to be used for photosynthesis, and then whatever is not used for photosynthesis is actually going to exit the leaves there. Meanwhile, the stomata are open, and so they're losing oxygen made from photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide is coming in. And so leaves are going to take in carbon dioxide, and they're going to use that carbon dioxide and oxygen to make food or glucose. And then that glucose is going to go down the phloem. So the phloem transports sugars to plant parts, wherever it might be needed. Others, leaves that maybe aren't doing enough, the stem, the trunk, whatever, okay? Generally, eventually it's going to reach the roots where they're going to be stored, okay? It's called the sink. And roots take in oxygen needed for cellular respiration. Think about it. This plant needs ATP. These roots need ATP to do their job, and they're not making any kind of glucose, so they have to actually do cellular respiration. And they actually release CO2. Okay, and they're going to store the sugar down there. So that's kind of how the overall gist of how plants work. So let's actually look at some transport mechanisms. So we're going to look at the roots first. Okay, so what happens is there's kind of three routes that a plant can transport things around. The first route is what we call the transmembrane route, and it actually goes through, as you can guess, through the membrane, through the cell wall, through the membrane, through the cell membrane, through the cell wall, through the cell membrane, and just goes like this. And so this is how minerals can get transported through the roots. Okay, so it's called the transmembrane. You might want to write some notes down about how it works, but basically it's just going to go through cell membranes and cell walls. Okay? The other way, or another way, I guess I should say, is what we call the symplast route. And this one's going to use these little tiny holes, much simpler, much faster. Those little tiny holes, if you remember, are called plasmodesmata to transport around. Okay? And so that's called the symplast route. I always think of it as the simplest route. And then the last way is they can actually transport in between the cell walls. And it's kind of hard to draw, but it's going to go in between the cell walls and never actually enter into a cell. Okay? And that's called apoplast route. Okay? Now, the reason why we talked about those is because we need to get our minerals into our xylem, right? Okay, so let's just label this picture. This is a root picture. So here's a root hair. Here is the epidermis. Here is the cortex. And then the endodermis. This should hopefully become familiar. Endodermis. And then this part here is the stele with the xylem in it. And then this little dark line, and those dark lines are called the Casparian strips. And those, remember those waxy strips that act like a barrier? Okay, and so you can actually have minerals go two ways into here. We can see, we'll look at the symplast route. Here it goes through those plasmodesmata, no problem. It's going to go through the cell and go right into the xylem. Okay, now, same pretty much with transmembrane transport. It's going to do the exact same thing. Now look what happens with the apoplast route. If it's cruising along like this, it's cruising along, all good. It reached the Casparian strip. Prevents it from going in, and so it has to go through a cell in order to get in. That's the key part, okay? So it has to go through a cell in order to get in, okay? So now that we have stuff in our roots, we're gonna transport that water up through the xylem, okay? So there's two parts to here. This is our xylem cells, our big fat cells. We're gonna look at just the transport of water. And hopefully most of you are saying that the transport of water occurs up a xylem due to adhesion and cohesion. Okay, so adhesion, oh my God, I can't spell. Let's try that again. Adhesion of water to keep water sticking to the cell walls, and cohesion keeps it sticking to itself, and it helps it form that column of water. Okay, and there's two types of cells here that we can look at, and so these ones, we'll color them in red, are what we call our tracheids. And remember, all of our xylem cells are dead. And these are long, thick cells. And water is going to move. See these little pits here? Well, you can't see. These little pits here? That's how water is going to move. Water moves from cell to cell through the pits. And then the other type of cell that's involved here, I'll color them in green, in our xylem, is, these are called vessel elements. And vessel elements are wider, shorter cells. And they have perforated ends that allow water to flow freely. And these are also dead, we should write, just to remind ourselves. So the ends are perforated or have holes in them to allow water to flow. Okay, so just because of cohesion and adhesion, water is going to get pulled up the stem. Now, the other thing that's actually pulling on the water is something called transpiration. Okay, transpiration, all it is, it's a fancy way to say evaporation of water from a leaf. Okay, and so let's just see what happens. We're going to draw it in steps, okay? And so what's going to happen is we're going to have right here, we're going to have water, draw it in purple, or blue, I mean, because it's water. Okay, and oxygen's also coming out, and then what's going in, our friend CO2 is going in, so we can go make glucose, okay? So that's what's happening right here. Step one, I'll draw step one right there, okay? Oh. And so step one is water exits the leaf through or via the stomata. This is assuming the stomata are open, okay? And so what happens is right here, where I drew a number 2, is, number 2, down here, the water potential in the air spaces decreases in the spongy mesophyll. So what happens is, step 3 is way up here. Okay, I kind of drew a 3 right here. I know it's hard to see, but that's 3. Okay. In step 3, water is going to want to go from where it's less concentrated, or from where it's more concentrated in the mesophyll cell to where it's less concentrated in the airspace. So water is pulled from the mesophyll cell. Now, 4, right there as well, right by my 3, okay? In this case, the water potential in my mesophyll cell has now decreased. So, where's water going to want to go? From where it's less concentrated up here in step 4 in the mesophyll cell to where it was more concentrated, which is actually at the top of my xylem. That's step 5. Okay, so step 5 down here, water is pulled from the top of the xylem. Okay, so basically it's just water potential decreases in one area, so it gets pulled from the nearby area, okay? And that's actually what's going to happen next. 6 and 7 you're not going to be able to see on here. The water potential at the top of the xylem will decrease. And so then water will be pulled up from roots. And using cohesion and adhesion to get water to stick together. Okay, so water's just going from one area to the next to the next. Now, what's controlling these guard cells from staying open and closing at certain times? Okay, so this is actually a guard cell. These are actually two guard cells and the stomata in the center, or the stoma in this case because it's only one, when it's open. Okay, so this is open. And what happens is, this is actually kind of a cool little process. During the day, the guard cells actually have little pumps and they accumulate potassium. Okay? And that's actually why potassium's a nutrient if you ever buy like fertilizer. And so what happens is the water potential decreases or becomes more negative. So where's water going to want to go? Water goes into the guard cell. And so the cells swell. And the stomata open. Another way to think about it is like if you had your hands like this and you were to fill them with water, they puff up. And so they make a hole. Okay, so this is them closed and there's no water, and then they fill with water and they puff up and they push against each other and they create a hole. Okay. The triggers for this, or what causes these stomata to open, there's a couple of things. They actually have a blue light receptor, so when they detect light, if there's not enough CO2 decrease in the air spaces, because they're trying to avoid photorespiration, or they actually have an internal clock too that tells them what time it is. Plants have that kind of similar to the internal clock that triggers them to flower. Okay, and then over here, this is when they close. It's pretty much just the opposite thing that happens. Like think about nighttime, or when it's like really there's a lot of transpiration, they're losing a lot of water. So the guard cell loses the potassium. Okay, and so the water potential is actually less negative inside the cell. So water exits. What happens to our little cell? It becomes like flaccid. Okay, so our guard cell becomes flaccid and our stomata close. Or the single stoma closes. Okay, so that's kind of how that is controlled based on how much water we have. Now, let's say, so we've got our water